All right, the video we're watching today on lunch break is going to be a new Soda TCG video, which we've obviously followed a couple of their videos in the past, and they've always been quite fun. Always comparing different card games, and as someone who's interested in card games in general, they're always a great watch. Today's video is titled, "How good are win the game effects in every card game?" Which is an interesting question, and when I'm seeing the thumbnail, it's already quite apparent that they are quite different in different card games, because, for example, I know Wheel of Death was a really good card in Hearthstone at the time when it came out. I don't know how good it is now, if they nerfed it or something, but it was a very good win con in that game. I also know Thassa's Oracle is a crazy good card in, I think, Commander in Magic. But then for YuGiOh, it's like Exodia and other auto wins have not been that relevant for a long time. But
this is my video about how good win the game is in every card game. Winning. So there are many different ways that you can win when you're playing a card game. The most typical we're going to see of these is just reduce your opponent's life total down to 0 as fast as possible. Typically, red aggressive decks in Magic or many other aggressive decks in other strategies and card games will use cards to reduce your opponent's life total from the highest point to the lowest point as soon as they can. However, there's
does it contain Shadowverse? Usually the Soda videos include Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Hearthstone. But if you're watching and you have input from other card games, feel free to write a comment and be like, yeah, in Shadowverse, it's crazy to win the game with that card or whatever. We can talk about it.
Any other decks that's focused on summoning a creature or monster.
I don't know much about Shadowverse myself, though, so I can't add to the discussion.
Simply use its powerful abilities and large attack points total to just beat your opponent to death using only one large card. If an individual card doesn't do it for you, you may want to beat your opponent.
Who cares about One Piece? I mean, I think they are including games that they have some sort of knowledge about, which maybe they haven't played One Piece. Maybe they have included One Piece at some point. But is there auto wins in One Piece? Does that exist? Because I'm not super familiar. I know how to play One Piece. I've played a couple of games, but I don't know like the cards in and out. I know they have one leader that's like skill drain. I think Blackbeard is the one where I was like, great. There's a leader that's skill drain. How fun is that? But yeah. Do they have alternate win conditions? Nami? Oh, is Nami? I've heard of that actually. Now that you're saying it. Is Nami the like deck that like wins if it decks itself out? That's a very fun win con, I think, from the outside. I think playing against it might not be fun, but the idea is funny.
One large one-hit combo. A card like Grim Patron isn't super strong on its own, only being a 5-mana 3/3, but with combos,
dude, I miss Grim Patron, dude.
Grim Patron summon a massive board and deal a ton of damage to your opponent all in one go. Or perhaps you prefer to take it a bit slower. You can simply wait for your opponent to run out of cards in what is aforementionedly called a stall deck. Pokemon Snorlax has the ability Block, which makes your opponent's active Pokemon unable to retreat. If that Pokemon can't damage you, you can simply sit there and wait, and as long as
Pokemon control decks are very funny.
Your opponent has less cards than you, they will run out of cards and die to decking out before you do. But what if we could just skip all this figuring out how to defeat our opponent stuff? What if you could just get to the good part of winning the game without having to actually have your opponent's life total get reduced to 0 or have your opponent run out of cards or anything like that? And this is where we have win the game effects which come in. A card which wins the game all by itself without you having to do absolutely anything to your opponent. A most famous example of this is Exodia the Forbidden One. If you can get all 5 pieces of Exodia in your hand at the same time, you simply...
Yeah, we kind of do have the OG win con, right? In Yu-Gi-Oh! I can't think of another like win con that is so iconic in other card games that you would know it past. Like, I mean, everyone knows Exodia, right? Being like the win con.
You win the game immediately. Exodia the Forbidden One is the way that Yugi wins in the absolute first episode of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, which makes it super duper iconic and something that almost every Yu-Gi-Oh player will know about. But almost every other card game also have effects which allow you to win the game in one single move. Magic's Door to Nothingness simply requires you to get 2 mana of each different color and sacrifice it while in play to make your opponent immediately lose the game. In Hearthstone, we have a card like Mecha'thun, which says if you have no cards in your deck, hand, and battlefield when he dies, it destroys the enemy hero, meaning that if you get to the very end of the game and Mecha'thun is your last card.
In Hearthstone, I will say, I've played Hearthstone every once in a while, somewhat actively. These cards seem to always at least be decent in Hearthstone. Because... yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's just Hearthstone designing those cards to actually be powerful. I feel like in Yu-Gi-Oh! These days, win the game effects are like purposely made so bad, right? I'm sure we're going to talk about that, but I feel like in Hearthstone, they actually, when they make such a card, they want it to be possible, right? They don't want it to be like a meme. They want it to be relevant, which I think that is almost the most important thing about these kind of effects and these kind of cards, right? Because it's up to the game's designers on whether they want this stuff to be viable. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, I feel like they just decided we don't want that stuff to be super viable, so it just isn't. In Hearthstone, it seems different. I don't know how it is in Magic.
When he dies, you will simply win. And the card Lost World from Pokemon is a stadium that says if your opponent has 6 or more Pokemon in the Lost Zone, you can immediately win the game. The one thing that you may know that all these cards share in common is that the cost for winning the game is absolutely huge. Having no cards in your deck or battlefield or hand, paying an absolute gargantuan amount of mana of all different colors, having your opponent have most of their deck in the Lost Zone, or having 5 very specific cards in your hand at the same time. They're all an absolutely massive cost. But my question is, how good are these effects, and are they worth the cost and all the hoops you have to jump through to win the game with one go? First, for Magic the Gathering. So how good are win the game effects in Magic the Gathering? Like Stasis Oracle here, which checks how many cards you have in your deck, and if it is less than the devotion you have, otherwise known as the number of blue symbols you have in play, you win the game. The answer is that cards that win the game in Magic have an absolutely massive range of possible playability rankings. They can either be a massive challenge and super duper hard to pull off, or can be an absolute staple and see tons of...
I mean, yeah, I think Thassa's Oracle, I think to this day, is one of the most popular win cons in like competitive Commander, right? I don't know in which other formats is relevant or legal even, because Magic has like 25 formats with 28 different ban lists. But in Commander, I think this card is still really, really... Like, this card is just broken, I think.
Constructed play all over many formats. A card like Thassa's Oracle or Laboratory Maniac seems like a large challenge. You have to completely run out of all the cards in your deck in order to be able to win with them. However, it is very easy to pair these cards with any card which removes all of your deck from the game, such as Inverter of Truth here, and then you can simply win the game when you draw a card with Lab Maniac, or if you have Thassa's Oracle, you can immediately win the game upon casting her. The fact that these cards combo with any card that destroys your deck makes it so that way they can basically always see play as they keep making new cards, which allow you to churn through a large amount to your deck and make it really, really easy, even in lower power formats, to win if you have these cards illegal at the same time. On the more
it is true that like these cards, when you just read them, you wouldn't know if they are actually good or not, right? Because these kind of cards do depend on the context of other cards in the game, because they basically both say if your deck is empty, you win the game. So the next question is like, well, how easy is it to get an empty deck? And then when you show me the next card and it's like, well, just destroy your entire deck. It's like, okay, well, that means it's pretty good. Where it's the same in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like if you read Exodia, right? You don't know immediately if you have never played Yu-Gi-Oh! Before, you don't know how hard it is to assemble those pieces. Maybe there's cards in the game that say add all 5 pieces from your deck to your hand, theoretically, right? Very simple example. All of a sudden, card's broken, of course, right? So
challenging side, as we see with Door to Nothingness, this is much more of a difficult effect to pull off in the game. Paying 15 total mana is an absolutely gargantuan amount, not to mention that you have to wait for Door to Nothingness to untap as it enters the battlefield tapped, and you have to have 10 mana of all the different colors of Magic. All of these prices makes it so that way when you activate Door to Nothingness, it's more of a challenge unlock
that card seems
rather than something you're actually going to try to do every game you play. Despite the difficulties in implementation, the ability to win the game with a single card is a super good feeling effect. It gives you an absolutely huge amount of power, really emphasizing the power of the card that you are using, and the fact that you can win the game in one move is something really threatening to your opponent. Something like a Planeswalker Ultimate is the perfect spot for a card that makes your opponent lose the game, or you win the game because it takes a lot to get to and feels really deserved and powerful when you do activate that effect. It also provides an interesting challenge for players. A card like Helix Pinnacle comes out and says that you have to get 100...
I wonder how people feel about this. Do you think these effects just shouldn't exist, or do you think there is a place for them? Because I think you could make an argument like if you actually have to work for it, if the card requires a lot of setup and work, then it's not that much different from someone pulling off like another combo that wins the game, right? Like some OTK or FTK or Unbreakable Board or whatever also requires a lot of setup. So it's like, if it's not too easy, then I don't really see the huge difference, I suppose.
mana and then put all of that mana into Helix Pinnacle, and then you can win the game on your upkeep. This, as a design idea, is really interesting because getting 100 mana is obviously hard, but if you can make a deck that makes a ton of mana, Helix Pinnacle is an easy way for you to win. This helps lead to lots of build around ideas when you can see a card that says win the game, like the deck of many things, and go, oh, if I can only roll a 20 with this card a single time, I can have a way to immediately win the game. In this way, you can design your entire deck around a single card, and it'll actually feel really good because you know that that card will win you the game if you can set it up. That idea.
It's crazy how many of these cards Magic has. Like, we're not even halfway through the video. They've already named like, what, 7 or 8 cards of Magic that do this. I can't even think of that many in Yu-Gi-Oh, I think. I can think of Exodia. I can think of the Ghost Trick Xyz. I can think of Final Countdown. Jackpot 7. Sumo Dice. Destiny Board, right? Destiny Board. Not many, though. I really can't think of many.
Of the one-hit kill is
number 80. Oh yeah, there's the puppet of strings thingy.
Play with cards, which allow them to win the game in
but
one
see
move.
that
a card like
it already goes to show, like in Yu-Gi-Oh, how non-existent these cards are. That like you can't even name a couple super easily because none of the cards we've just mentioned are actually relevant, right?
Coalition Victory is probably the least good feeling example of it, and still feels pretty good because you need to get a basic land of each color and a creature that is each different type of color. In this way, it doesn't feel that great for your opponent as you instantly win the game in one move. However, it feels great playing with it, and a lot of these cards have a slower win con, therefore your opponent will have some time to kind of try to counteract your ability to win the game in one move. Now for Yu-Gi-Oh! So how good are the win the game effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like the famous Exodia the Forbidden one, which lets you win the game in a single turn by having all 5 different pieces of Exodia in your hand. The sad answer is that almost all of them are super bad, like really incredibly bad. They all have enormous costs that make them almost all completely unplayable and way worse than just winning the game in a normal manner. My favorite example of this is Holaki, the creator of Light. This card can only be special summoned by tributing 3 monsters from your field that are specifically Slifer, Obelisk, and the Winged Dragon of Ra, which are 3 of the most powerful monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! My question is, why would you go through all the work of summoning this card and then immediately win the game when you already have those 3 monsters in play? If you went through all the work of summoning the 3 legendary god monsters, you don't need to do anything else. You've probably already won.
Funnily enough, this is not true, right? Funnily enough, if someone summons all 3 of those, that board's probably hella weak. That board hella weak, dude. It also doesn't help that this card isn't even released in the TCG, right? I think the OCG has it as a card, but even that might be incorrect, but the TCG does not have this card.
This way, most Yu-Gi-Oh! Effects that win you the game end up being like this. You go through all the work, you could have just done that work to win the game normally already. The most playable example of a card that wins the game immediately is probably Last Turn, which is an absolute ruling nightmare and is something that you definitely shouldn't have put into the game. The idea of Last Turn is that you and your opponent both summon a monster from your deck, and whichever monster is bigger, that player wins the duel. But this is kind of not really working because the main thing you win with Last Turn is that you summon a monster that stops your opponent from being able to special summon monsters from their deck. In this way, you win by default because you're the only one who has a monster left in play, and this is the way that Last Turn is regularly played, which both isn't the intention of the card and also makes the card a one-hit kill for basically nothing. The other more fair example of win the game card is probably Final Countdown, which forces you to pay 2,000.
I mean, it's at least worth pointing out, right, that like all 3 of these cards, excluding Holacti, of course, have seen play at certain times in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, right? There was a time where Final Countdown, Stall, Control, whatever, Exodia, either as a control stall deck as well, or FTK, like those decks have seen play way back in the day, though. Like we're talking like 15 plus years ago, maybe even 20 years. And then Last Turn, of course, has been banned ever since because of that stupid interaction with like Jaugen and stuff like that. Yeah, but like it's just like these cards are terrible nowadays. They used to be okay. Like Final Countdown used to be a deck in like 2009 or whatever. It was a deck.
Life points, and then after 20 turns you immediately win the duel. This can't be really interacted with in any way though, so it basically just says if your opponent can kill you in that time, you lose, and if your opponent can't kill you in that time, you win. In this way, Final Countdown decks end up being really boring and just kind of stalling out for as long as possible until the Final Countdown comes to the end, making this win the game card pretty powerful but feel pretty bad to play with and against. And whilst they have kept the win the game effects in Yu-Gi-Oh pretty weak, I think this has still led to Exodia shaping the game in a major way, which I can call kind of the Exodia effect. So Exodia only asks for you to have 5 specific cards in your hand at the same time. You start with 5 cards in your hand at the beginning of the duel, meaning that if you had Exodia and an easy way to get to Exodia pieces with most of the cards in your deck, you could almost always win the duel on the very first turn of the game. In almost any other card game, this would be insanely easy because putting 5 duds in your deck is something that happens in almost every other card game by default. You having 5 cards in your deck that don't really do anything to contribute to your strategy until the end is pretty common in many control decks or combo decks, or maybe just having lands and magic can feel like duds when you end up drawing them in the late game. This is partially part of the reason why Yu-Gi-Oh has the most hamstring draw in any card game that...
Do you think that's true? Do you think it wouldn't, like, do you think this would be good, let's say in Hearthstone? Do you think this would be a good way to play a control deck? If it's like you don't have to worry about any other win condition. You just have 5 pieces of Exodia in your Hearthstone deck. And so you can build your entire deck around like stalling the game out. And if you draw those 5 together at the end of the day, at the end of the game, you would win immediately. I can definitely see it. I think it would very heavily depend on the surrounding, because Hearthstone, I think Hearthstone has had those kind of control decks that focus very heavily on like certain win cons or combos at the end of the day, or at the end of the game, and they have implemented counterplay to it, right? They have implemented ways to interact with your opponent's hand or deck, like destroy cards from it or take cards out from it. Like they made Dirty Rat, which is a card that forces the opponent to summon a card from their hand, right? And then you can kill it. Like that's how you can like snipe combo pieces out of their hand. So like if those cards are in the format, I think a deck like that would be terrible. If you have no other win con and they take one Exodia piece away, it wouldn't work. But like there is a world where that can work in Hearthstone or maybe Magic. Yeah, definitely.
I've ever seen. Draw effects are super duper valuable in Yu-Gi-Oh! And oftentimes have workarounds built in so that way you can't find very specific cards easily or build your entire deck around the fact that you just want to draw to specific cards. If we look at the generic draw on a card like Pot of Desires or Danger Jackalope, you can see that they both have effects which either remove cards from your deck or cards from your hand at random. In this way, you can't build your entire deck around just drawing cards until you have Exodia in your hand, because most of the time you will end up either banishing or discarding a key piece you need, and then your combo will no longer work. This is why Yu-Gi-Oh focuses way more on searching effects, which target specific monsters or spells in your deck and get them into your hand, rather than generic ones, because if they were all generic, Exodia would run the format all the time. In this way, Yu-Gi-Oh has made a really interesting design decision by releasing Exodia in the first set that has rippled out into the rest of the game. Now for Hearthstone. So how good are win the game effects in Hearthstone? Like previously mentioned, Mechathune, which allows you to defeat the enemy hero if you have no cards in your hand, deck, and battlefield when Mechathune dies. And the answer is pretty good. I think they are almost all strong win cons and end up seeing a decent amount of play, despite the fact that they usually have a pretty high cost associated. Basically, all of the cards which have an alternate way to win the game have ended up seeing play in some extent, and yet they still feel relatively balanced, as usually it is a pretty lengthy cost to get them working. Mechathune, for example, has been proven as a late game combo in standard and other formats by using Reckless Experimenter and combining it with the card Ticking Abomination and Coffin Crasher. By playing 2 Ticking Abominations, a Coffin Crasher down, you can summon Mechathune and then destroy your entire board in one go, meaning that all you have to do is have no cards in hand and no cards in deck. Much easier to achieve in a priest that basically spends the entire game controlling and waiting to get to this late game combo. The original win the game card, Uther of the Ebon Blade, worked in a similar manner. By using your hero power to summon a 2/2 horseman, the idea was that
I remember this one.
4 different horsemen, and if you control them all at the same time, you would win the game. This would be hard to do unless you did it all in the same turn by using a card like Auction Master Beardo, which says whenever you cast a spell, you refresh your hero power. By stacking up many cheap spells, you can basically play down Auction Master Beardo and summon all 4 horsemen in the same turn, one-shot killing your opponent, in a similar manner to the Priest-style deck, where you're just trying to control the board until you can set up your combo. But it's not only combo decks that use the different win the game style effects in Hearthstone. All sorts of different decks have different payoffs that win the game built for specifically them. In terms of control payoffs, we have Rivendare War Rider, which has the death rattle to shuffle 3 horsemen into your deck. These horsemen each check when the other horsemen have died, and when the 4th one dies, it destroys the enemy hero, similar to Uther did with the 4 horsemen of the prior times. In this way, any deck that plays Rivendare War Rider will have some sort of inevitability built into the end of the game. There's also the Seek Guidance questline from Priest, which allows you to discover a card from your deck when you play 2, 3, and 4 cost cards. At the end of the long questline, once you played up to an 8 mana worth of card, it will give you Xyrella the Sanctified, which puts the Purified Purified Shard into your deck, which is a card that destroys your enemy hero altogether. In this way, both of these control decks gain some inevitability. No matter what your opponent is doing, you will always have a...
I think if you've ever played Hearthstone, I feel like, as someone who's played Hearthstone back in the day, I thought this was boring. I thought this removed a very core element out of control decks, which was the question, how do you actually win the game? And I thought that was kind of annoying, that it was just like, okay, now control is just, you build your control deck however you want. All of it is removal, all of it is control tools, and then you have one win condition at the end of the game. And that just feels like, it feels too easy in some instances and like too straightforward and too boring. Like, I feel like it was more fun before they added a lot of those, because Hearthstone definitely had a lot of those kind of cards where the control decks just turned into play control tools early and board clears and whatever, and then you build towards that one huge win condition, and I just didn't vibe with that so much.
Card in your deck, which makes your opponent instantly lose the game. Notable about these cards is that they all shuffle their win cons into the deck, meaning not only does your opponent get the chance to see that you are going to win the game eventually if they do not do anything to stop you, however, it can take a random amount of time for you to end up winning the game, meaning that these can only be played in really slow control decks that take an absolute ton of time to get to their inevitable win cons. For the best of the win the game cards, we have to look at the one that is both a combo and the payoff for its own strategy, Wheel of Death. Wheel of Death destroys your deck and then in 5 turns destroys the enemy hero, similar to Final Countdown from YuGiOh.
Yeah, this is like a giga cracked version of Final Countdown, because it's in a inherently slower game than Yu-Gi-Oh, and it's only in 5 turns. So like and in Hearthstone you don't deck out, right? You just take fatigue damage. So destroying your deck does not mean you lose next turn. It just means you take some damage over the course of the next couple of turns. But if you were ever in a somewhat healthy position around turn 8 and you just slap that card down, the game just ends.
In destroying your deck, it seems like a downside as you will start taking fatigue, but ends up being an upside when played with this card, Phenom Lord of the Opera, which will cost 0 mana for a 15/15 taunt lifesteal if you destroy your entire deck. In this way, Wheel of Death ends up being powerful on both halves. Being a way to guarantee destroy your deck allows you to play powerful cards like Phenom in your deck and know that you will be able to get value out of them in the course of the game, but it is also powerful as even if you do not...
There are ways to put cards back into your deck after it too. Yeah, there are ways in the game to put cards back into your deck so you're not decked out, actually.
Win the game from your powerful...
I mean, the bigger deal about Wheel of Death is not the fact that it destroys your deck. I think it's genuinely, can you afford to pay 8 mana without falling too behind on the board? That was the way bigger question when activating this card, right? Because that was sometimes the reason why you lost after you used it, is because you have to afford to just skip a turn, basically, when your opponent likely already has a board. So that's what you're trying to find a spot where like you're not threatened too much.
Have no cards and deck abilities. You will also be able to win the game if you simply wait 5 turns, meaning that your opponent not only has to deal with your large board when you play Wheel of Death, but also has to deal with the fact that you are going to win the game soon and must defeat you quickly in order to win. And finally for Pokemon. So how good are win the game effects in Pokemon? Like Lost World here, which says you win the game if your opponent has 6 or more cards in the Lost Zone, which is their effective word for exile or banish in Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically cards that have been removed.
Yeah, but like Pokemon, I mean, I know there's a deck now that does this, right? Kill Jaden in Hearthstone? Kill Jaden Hearthstone. Replace your deck with an endless portal of demons. Each turn they gain an additional 2/2. Oh, so it's just like you cannot deck out anymore, right? Because you play this. Okay, yeah.
The game. The sad answer is they are almost...
In Pokemon, there's a deck right now that uses the Lost Zone pretty extensively, right? Isn't it? What was it? The comfy one? But like previously, when I played Pokemon like years ago, there was not a single deck that really interacted with the banish pile, right? It rotated. Oh, okay, well then it was a thing like a year or 2 ago. I follow some Pokemon players on like Twitter, and I kept seeing posts about it, but seems like it's not a thing anymore. But like for the majority of Pokemon's lifespan, I think the Lost Zone / Banished Zone just doesn't see use, right? Like it's just not something they actively involve in the game. which feels like a deliberate decision.
Always very, very weak. A card like Lost World is super hard to utilize because it not only relies on your opponent's cards being Pokemon put into the Lost Zone, which is relatively hard to do from your side of the board, but it also relies on them having no way to interact with Lost World
Giratina used it a lot. It seems very fitting for Giratina to be the one using it, right?
before it gets put down, meaning that if your opponent simply wins the game before you have the chance to activate Lost World, you're basically making no progress towards actually stopping your opponent from doing anything while setting up your Lost World win. Unless they are combo payoffs, almost all of the win the game effects in Pokemon have seen effectively no play. Even in the standard format, most of them have seen basically no play whatsoever. The Pokemon Unknown Hand allows you to check if you have 35 cards in your hand, and if you have Unknown in your active slot, you can activate its ability to win the game.
If you have 35 or more cards in your hand, you win the game. And the ability is just called Hand. Yeah, sure, dude. Did you know that this ability also exists in Yu-Gi-Oh? If you have 35 cards in your hand, you do typically win the game.
Immediately. This card is good if you have a very, very slow stalling deck with basically no way to win, but only ways to disrupt your opponent. You can play down Unknown Hand and then slowly wait over and over turn after turn until you have enough cards in your hand to win the game, being a super duper slow stall style win-off. Probably the strongest win the game card, at least in the expanded format, is Unknown Damage, which says if you have 66 damage counters on all of your bench Pokemon while you have Unknown in the active, you can
66 or more damage counters on your benched Pokemon. That is... You need some pretty big Pokemon on the bench, I suppose. You definitely can't do it with like 100 HP basics. 660 damage means on average like 130 damage, slightly more than on each Pokemon. Yeah.
Win the game. Even though 66 damage sounds like a lot and is a lot if you are just waiting for your opponent to do damage to your cards, this card can be set up with a large combo, as Pokemon has a really easy way to set up bench combos in the game to win you in one go. By utilizing Reuniclus's damage swap ability to move damage counters around from any Pokemon that you like, along with large HP bench Pokemon on your bench to take all the damage, 300 plus HP Pokemon to soak up that 66 damage, you can combine cards like Team Magma Secret Base, which puts 2 damage counters on your bench Pokemon whenever you were to play them down, along with a card like Weevil, which allows you to pick up Poketool cards into your hand.
You said super easy, and now you're showing me a stage 2, a stage 1, and a stadium.
And Klefki, which you can play as a Pokemon and then equip as a Poketool. In this way, you can basically put infinite damage onto your bench, and by putting infinite damage onto your bench, you can just simply have Reuniclus move it around until you have enough damage to set up.
Is this a thing? Is this like a deck in Expanded? Because Expanded is their format where everything is legal, right? No rotation. Is that a deck? I mean, at the same time, it's Pokemon, right? You can play cards that draw you 7 cards. So it's like a 5-card combo with some setup or whatever. It doesn't actually seem that crazy in Pokemon.
Your Unknown win. This way, Unknown ends up being a pretty powerful expanded payoff and is the reason why the card is banned in the expanded format. This early game win can be as early as turn 2 and is generally frowned upon by Pokemon as it wants you to get through most of your prize cards, typically taking at least 4 or 5 turns to win the game. From my perspective, Pokemon has very underexplored the amount of things they can do with cards which win you the game in one go compared to all of the other card games that I've shown you today. Most of them rely on your opponent to do something or opponent to allow you to do something to them over many, many turns, and that really never works if it is the main way that you are planning on winning the game. My favorite example of this is Unknown Missing, which has, if your opponent has 12 supporter cards in the Lost Zone, you can use its ability to win the game. Not only does your opponent have to put 12 supporter cards into their deck to put into the Lost Zone, you are the one who has to force them to put it into the Lost Zone in some way, which is super duper difficult.
What is it with the unknowns all having auto win conditions?
This way, Unknown Missing has never seen any play and seems like a card that is almost impossible to activate. Also, this is almost all of the cards that have the text "you win the game" on it in Pokemon, which feels like a really missed opportunity if you ask me. Almost all of the other effects are basically the same. Here are 3 cards with the same effect which allow you to win the game. Unknown V, Slowbro, and Ends Sigilyph. All of these cards have the effectively same attack, which is 3 energy, to say if you only have 1 prize card remaining, you win the game, which is really pointless because if you only have 1 prize card remaining, you're super close to winning the game already. You could just use any attack, which takes any prize card from your opponent, and then you would win the game.
Yeah.
In this way, these cards basically have no text on them and have never seen any play, and they're also one of the only examples in Pokemon of cards which win the game immediately, which I think is a big missed opportunity. Because Pokemon is focused on making the game go longer and last over multiple turns of you knocking out your opponent's Pokemon and gaining slow occurring
I think it's also just the fact that Pokemon has the lowest amount of interaction with the opponent's strategy directly, right? Like there are some cards that like interrupt your opponent, of course, in Pokemon, but it's not like if your opponent just has the cards they need to pull something like this off, it's not like you can really stop them, right? It's not like Yu-Gi-Oh or Magic where you can throw cards at your opponent that will interrupt them from doing that thing. At least for the majority of Pokemon's lifespan, I think they had like a format where they had a card that was like an effect veiler, like a way to negate something on the opponent's turn. But that's like, at this point, I think that's like 15 years ago or something. And they very rarely have something that stops anything on the opponent's turn. I think that's why they're very cautious about doing something like this.
This made win the game effects either super duper weak or super duper hard to implement in a way that doesn't break the game. I can see why Pokemon shies away from implementing this mechanic more into their game. However, I think it would be really powerful and interesting if they did. So, in conclusion,
it is hard to balance, right? Like you'd have to make it achievable, but not too easy, because then if people just can't interact with you, it's difficult. I can see why they're like hesitant on doing it. I'm honestly, the Pokemon talk made me more surprised that they don't have more stuff that interacts with the Lost Zone, right? Because the Lost Zone in Pokemon, it's very hard to get stuff back from there. So it surprises me that they don't have cards like, I mean, comparable to like DD Crow, like a way to get rid of an opponent's Pokemon for good, for like resource management purposes. Surprising they don't really have much of that.
Winning the game is an awesome effect to put in your card game. I think it's pretty obvious by looking at Exodia and the impact it has on almost every card game after it was printed that winning the game with a single card is super iconic and really good feeling. It can be used to create a lot of interesting challenges for both designers and for players, with Exodia putting 4 different cards.
But ultimately, here's the thing, right? Implementing these kind of effects is very risky, and you always have to ask yourself the question, is it worth it, right? Because if the card ends up being too powerful, then you end up creating a menace in the format that like FTKs people or wins games with very few interactions way too quickly or whatever, and then people don't enjoy that, or people don't feel like they ever have a chance of winning against this sort of thing because it just auto wins no matter how good your board is, no matter how close you are to winning yourself. Like the potential risks of implementing effects like this is, I think, why most of the time I would agree with the designers of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon to not make these cards very realistically powerful. Because I think there's better ways to make challenging decks or control decks that work towards a certain goal. Like I said with Hearthstone earlier, I think there was always cool control decks in Hearthstone, and they didn't need to add auto wins to those concepts to keep them relevant. All they had to do was print good control cards, and people would have played control anyways, but it would have felt more balanced towards the end of the game. And also, I think more interesting. I think as a control player myself, I don't really enjoy just controlling the game for 10 turns and just activate one card that reads win the game. I don't think it's that interesting of a concept overall.
That do nothing in your deck, only to win, or with my favorite example of this, Battle of Wits, which asks you to have 200 or more cards in your deck at the same time. 200 cards seems like a huge amount. Not only do you have to draw the Battle of Wits, but you also need to find a way to make your deck actually work with 200 cards. Super interesting. It can also be used to help provide inevitability to your end of the game. A card like Rivendell War Rider.
See, but is it super interesting? Is it super interesting? Is it fun if you play against someone who's put 200 cards in their deck and then just drawn the Battle of Wits? Is it that fun? I don't know if it is.
I think is a good design because it only works in super duper slow control decks, meaning you have to wait a long time to get your I win the game effect. However, it does put an endpoint at the end of almost any game, meaning that you won't be forced to sit and wait for your opponent to absolutely run out every single card in their deck every single time you play against a slow controlling style deck. The only real downside I can see with it is that these type of effects can be game breaking if they are not handled with enough caution. A card like Unknown Damage probably wasn't meant to let you win the game on the second turn of the game, especially in a slow game like Pokemon. However, it ended up doing that, meaning that it kind of breaks the game and enforced to be banned. In this way, cards that win the game need to be able to be handled in such a fashion that they are good challenges and reward you for winning the game, either in a slow control deck or a combo style deck, but not make the combo so good that you win the game before anything really goes on. And that's the video. Thanks for watching.
It's an interesting topic, I think. I like these little videos that just make you think about the approaches to card games and how different card games handle these. Once again, enjoyed watching that one. I'll leave the link. I'll leave the link in the chat right now if anyone wants to show Soda TCG some love.